everybody, and welcome to today's Dementia Researcher Salon Debate. I'm Adam Smith, I'm the Programme Director for Dementia Researcher, and I'll be your host for the next hour. Thank you very much for joining us here in the Dementia Researcher community. Today, we're discussing a question that lies at the heart of dementia policy and research funding priorities. This House believes that the prevention should receive more research funding than cure in dementia. Prevention strategies from lifestyle interventions to early detection are gaining prominence in research and policy, but should they take precedence over efforts to develop treatments or find a cure? Speaking for the motion, we have Sarah Page, Programme Lead for Occupational Therapy at Manchester Metropolitan University. Her work centres on dementia, later life wellbeing, and person-centred occupational approaches, exploring how everyday environments and routines support quality of life as dementia progresses. Is that about right, Sarah? Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's about right. Thank you. That's a lovely introduction.
Perfect. And speaking against the motion in favour of cure over prevention, we have Lewis Tojo, is a senior commercial manager at UCL Partners, specialising in health innovation and strategic partnership. His work accelerates translation of research into practice by supporting collaborations, commercialisation, and innovations across the NHS, academia, and industry. Is that also right, Lewis?
Yeah, that's all correct. Thanks so much.
Close enough. Let me start. For those of you who haven't attended one of our previous debates, they're of course available for you to watch in the community if you want to catch up. But let me just explain the format. We're going to start with an audience vote to gauge your opinion on this topic as things currently stand. You'll find a link in the comments, and if you were registered to attend about an hour ago, you would have been sent that over email too. And I'll give you all, while I'm reading out the format, please do take a second to jump across and vote. I know that means leaving and then coming back again. Sorry. But if you could do that now, that would be great. So yes, we're going to start with the vote to gauge your current views. And then each of our speakers will talk for 10 minutes, giving opening statements to present their case. Then we'll move on with 15 minutes of exchange and rebuttal. Well, I'll invite each speaker to respond to the other one's points. And after that, we'll open the floor for audience questions. We'll have 15 minutes for Q&A, where you can submit those using the Q&A button at the bottom. You can do that at any time. You don't have to wait for the Q&A to start. I've enabled Q&A now, so you can put your questions at any time. And then finally, each speaker will have a couple of minutes to provide closing remarks, and then we'll end with a final audience vote to see how opinions have shifted. So I'm going to start now by quickly reminding you to go to that vote. I'm going to share my screen and let's see how we currently stand at the start. So there we go. This House, just a reminder of the motion again, this House believes that prevention should receive more research funding than cure in dementia. This is interesting. This has already shifted from before we started. So 47% of you are agreeing with that motion, 29% disagreeing, and 24% undecided. So Sarah, you're in the lead as we go into the debate.
Yeah, no pressure.
But 24% of, slight shift there, 22% of our audience are still to be persuaded and swayed. So Lewis, there's room for maneuver there. You could persuade some of that 44% over to your side, or we've got our 26% undecided. Which of you today is going to capture those undecided swing voters over to your way of thinking? Of course, these are very friendly debates, just as a reminder. And in reality, all of us here know, both in the audience, that what we should really be funding is cure and prevention and all the different areas that need funding in research. But this is a topical issue, one that I think is important to discuss. So we're very lucky to have Sarah and Lewis with us. And Sarah, I'm going to invite you now to take, I'll be closing that voting in about 1 minute's time. So if you still haven't voted, do still get that in. But Sarah, I'm going to hand over to you now and start the timer. You have 10 minutes to make your case.
Okay, thank you very much. So hello, my name is Sarah Page. I'm an occupational therapist and I lead the education of students about dementia at the Manchester Metropolitan University. and that's in the MSc Pre-Reg Occupational Therapy programme. But I am also a dementia researcher, and my passion has come from being a carer for my mother Marjorie, who also had fronto-temporal dementia. So I really understand personally how dementia affects everyone that it's connected with. So I'm very passionate about the preventative role that we have in dementia. So the question we are debating here is, should prevention in dementia receive more research funding than cure? That's a very, very good and important question. And my opinion is there isn't enough funding for the prevention of dementia. And there are many researchers and experts who would argue that funding for prevention remains inadequate and it is under-resourced. We shall now explore together the estimated figures of people affected by dementia, because that's important for us to acknowledge. So currently we understand that dementia affects tens of millions of people worldwide, with numbers expected to triple by 2050. And that's due to us having an ageing population. So despite decades of effort, there is still no definitive cure. And we know that most treatments only slow down the symptoms of dementia, and sometimes that slowing down is modestly. I've worked for many years in dementia care, and I've seen how medication can sometimes help, but I've also seen how other strategies can help and support in other areas as well. So surely this should make prevention an increasing focus for research and for funding. So I want to explore next about the financial cost of dementia. So if we explore together the spending from the UK government, there are estimations that the total spend on dementia research was 96.9 million. Yet do we have a cure? At present, there is no cure for dementia, meaning that no treatment can fully stop or reverse the underlying brain damage. Yet billions has been spent on drug development, and yet most trials have failed and produced only small benefits as well, meaning that prevention can often offer a high return on investment compared to cure research that has yielded limited results for decades. And if we acknowledge as well and make a comparison, say, with cancer care and research, we are at least 15 or 20 years behind research into prevention for dementia as well. So although I do acknowledge there are treatments that can slow the progression of dementia and ease some of the symptoms, however, if I use the analogy of taking a paracetamol for a headache, the medication relieves or takes away the symptoms. But if we think what could actually have been put into place as the prevention measure to have prevented the headache in the first place? Next, I want to focus upon how much funding needs to go into dementia prevention and, importantly, why. So we know that dementia affects approximately 1 million people in the UK, and we know those figures are going to go up year on year. And we also know that the annual cost on the UK economy can be in the figures of 42 billion. And that includes health, social care, and predominantly a large proportion of unpaid carers. Yet only around a small proportion goes into dementia research, and even smaller of a fraction of that goes into prevention specific research as well. And that's been taken from the Alzheimer's Society and also from parliamentary documents as well. So if we think about, actually 40% of dementia could be preventable, and occupational therapy has a role within this as well. There have been large global analysis and commissions that show that addressing modifiable risk factors could actually prevent or delay 4 in 10 cases. Some of these key risk factors are midlife hypertension, diabetes, obesity, thinking about hearing loss, physical inactivity, and then we go on to talk about smoking, excessive alcohol intake, and not to mention social isolation. Social isolation is huge within dementia. Sometimes people can be really lonely, and there is a high cost of loneliness as well around dementia. Yet preventative work targeting these areas rarely receives dementia funding, and yet it's usually buried within a lot of public health budgets as well. So if we think the prevention giving a huge economic return could actually be that if we invested a small amount of money and invested that into larger pools of money into prevention, we could look at blood pressure control. We could look at exercise health promotion. We could look at more overlaps with, for example, cardiovascular and stroke prevention as well. So what I'm going to explore next is how much prevention funding matters. We know that prevention interventions such as education around vascular health can reduce dementia risks. We also know that we are under, unfortunately, a straining, stretched NHS and social care system. So prevention is really, really key, and it's really, really important. We've also got recently the NHS 10-year health plan. That's come at a really, really timely moment, certainly around the preventive arena. It's come really, really timely when it comes to the types of infrastructures that need to be embedded so that we have got some key identifiable resources so that we can help people with dementia live well and to live longer. And this is really, really important. We know that with the growing evidence that 40% of dementia cases can be preventable as well. And again, that's through lifestyle changes. And there is a key role for that social and economic benefit. But if we think about dementia prevention, I want to also talk about the valuable role that occupational therapy has as well. So within occupational therapy, we are a holistic person-centered profession, and we engage people in their meaningful occupations. We are key in enhancing cognitive reserve and delaying cognitive decline. We work with people alongside all of the increased dementia risk factors, and we health promote, and we look at making sure that people with dementia live as long and as well as they can do. An example of this is that our professional body, the Royal College of Occupational Therapy, our patron is the Princess Royal, and the Princess Royal recently visited an NHS trust exploring the vital role of occupational therapy and how occupational therapists play an important role in health inequalities and health promotion. The RCOT also has and endorses lots of different policies and strategies within the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence, NICE. We have different research strategies, and we have different areas where we have focused upon preventative measures for people living with dementia. If I then go on to look at some conclusions around my position on preventative measures within dementia care, what I want to kind of round up and conclude before I pass on to my colleague is that prevention should receive more research funding, but not because treatment research and cure isn't as unimportant, but because we know that preventative approaches often are underfunding despite the cost-effective and beneficial long-term benefits. Prevention in dementia care should receive more research funding, not at the expense of cure, but to correct an existing imbalance. We know there is overwhelming evidence that dementia prevention is both possible and cost-effective, but current funding and policy delivery are far below what is needed. And investing in prevention, in more preventative research, public health programs could save tens of billions of pounds. It would improve quality of life and reduce NHS and social care pressure in the long term. But finally, from an ethical position, it's important that as human beings that we stop suffering before it starts, rather than merely react to it. It's often seen as more humane to stop suffering before it starts than merely to react to it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Sarah. A very compelling case. And now we're going to hand over to Lewis, who's going to make the case for why this motion shouldn't be passed today. Lewis, over to you.
Thanks so much. And thanks, Sarah, for excellent arguments in favor of prevention research. And I think that many of the points that Sarah mentioned are extremely valid and strong. I agree that prevention sounds sensible, it sounds efficient, it sounds the right thing to do in many ways, but it also sounds like a promise decades away, while dementia is destroying lives right now. So to give a little bit of background to me, so I'm Luis, I'm a senior commercial manager at UCL Partners. I have a background in psychology and in neuropsychology, so I have a master's in cognitive and clinical neuroscience, specializing in neuropsychology, and I've worked with dementia patients for the last 10 years. And currently I lead the dementia priority area in UCL Partners, which are one of the NHS England's health innovation networks, where I work on working with clinicians and people with lived experience to implement strategies that could reduce the impact and burden of dementia, not only for the system, but also for patients and carers. I think that it's really important to note that while this sounds like prevention is promising, there are currently 50 million people living with dementia right now. And these are 50 million people whose families are watching helplessly as the condition of their loved ones worsens. For decades, we've failed to develop treatments for dementia. We've had false start after false start, billions spent, as Sarah mentioned, with nothing to show for it. But finally, in the last few years, particularly in 23 and 24, we achieved breakthroughs. So for the first time in history, we have drugs that actually show that they slow Alzheimer's progression, and we are finally on the cusp of transforming dementia from a death sentence into a potentially manageable condition. And now, at this precise moment that we have this scientific breakthrough, we're being asked to pivot our funding away from treatments. And in my opinion, the timing couldn't be worse. This would be the equivalent of discovering antibiotics and then deciding to focus on preventing infections instead, when we should be really focusing, in my opinion, on investing more on understanding why these treatments are working and why we should continue to pursue this untangling why this pathology could potentially be reduced or altogether treated. So this motion asks us to redirect funding away from treatments that can help people today towards long-term prevention strategies whose effects are uncertain. In my opinion, this is not strategic, and I would disagree with Sarah that it is not humane either. Often I have conversations with people with lived experience and NHS stakeholders, and they ask, what if people get diagnosed? How does that help if there's no good treatment yet? Why would anyone want to get diagnosed? And I want to be able to give people an answer, and that is why I am opposing this motion. I think that there's quite a few arguments in favor of funding more treatment. One of them, as I mentioned, is that we are just now achieving these breakthroughs, and when a therapy that reduces amyloid, which is what these disease-modifying therapies are doing, actually slows decline, it's not time to abandon treatment science, but it's actually time to double down and invest further in it. One argument that we have against also prevention evidence is that this tends to be also in many ways contradictory. We see that the current evidence from a recent report from the National Academy of Medicine shows that evidence is limited, and there are not yet any specific interventions that warrant public health recommendation for dementia prevention, although this is now shifting with disease-modifying therapies. And I think that the argument for the disease-modifying therapies is definitely a strong one to have. However, as Sarah mentioned, this only affects 45% of dementia cases. So what happens to the 55% of the ones that are not preventable? That would mean shifting funding away from treatment of people that would not have this preventable dementia that is addressed by disease-modifying therapies. Right now, we have 50 million people. So this would mean that 27.5 million of these people would be at a disadvantage for shifting away treatments from this population. So true, in theoretical populations, these models could address this, but that's conditional on perfect, lifelong implementation of very complex social and medical interventions. It's not a guaranteed outcome that these 45% would actually be preventable. And also these models don't equal scalable, equitable impact. I also think that there is also a very strong argument to be made around equity. There is a very high risk that prevention-focused funding actually risks widening health inequalities. Lifestyle-based prevention and health promotion programs are proved to disproportionately benefit people with more resources, so people that have higher levels of income, higher levels of education, and ease of access to services. So tackling these social determinants like education, poverty, air pollution requires public policy and social spending, not just biomedical research money. And a larger reallocation towards prevention research could leave both treatment development and socioeconomic policy underfunding, which would also worsen this inequity. So it seems like there is an argument to be made that actually prevention strategies, while very compelling, they actually could be widening this gap. In terms, my other argument is that access to diagnostics and to treatment implementation also need funding. So only focusing on prevention ignores the diagnostic element and access and implementation of this. So a life-saving drug is going to be useless if people cannot be diagnosed or cannot afford it. So developing a therapy is one step, but diagnosing people early and making treatments safe, affordable, and accessible requires investment. And this is system-wide investment that would be really important to address and to have commitment from. Now, one of the arguments that Sarah said is she used the comparison of taking paracetamol for a headache, and maybe it should have been a prevention to a measure to prevent the headache. Well, my argument is that, first of all, paracetamol treats symptoms. It's not a disease-modifying therapy. So we don't want treatments that are going to only be treating the symptoms of dementia. We want disease-modifying therapies, which are the ones that are currently being developed that they are showing will promise. And this is, in my opinion, a comparison that it would not be fair. And also, by the time that you have a headache, you wouldn't have known that you would develop an headache. There's no biomarkers for this. Whereas for dementia, we are now seeing that there is increasing research showing blood-based biomarkers and also cognitive markers that can be detected through cognitive assessments, particularly digital cognitive assessments that are currently being developed. And then finally, I think that Sarah mentioned that there is a valuable role that occupational therapy has, and I completely agree. But I think it's also interesting that this actually aligns with my argument to have more investment in treatments and holistic treatments with multidisciplinary teams that should be combined with existing pharmaceutical treatments in the pipeline. Occupational therapy is incredibly important, but you wouldn't be prescribed occupational therapy to prevent dementia. You will be prescribed occupational therapy if you are diagnosed at the treatment stage, and this should be paired up with any treatment regimen that will be put in place. So, in conclusion, I think that prevention is essential. I completely agree, but it's not a magical bullet, and it will not help the millions already suffering today. We should expand prevention where it's proven, where it's equitable, but not by starving treatment science that has finally started to deliver. And now we should be actually doubling down and capitalizing on the recent findings. So the moral choice is to fund both, accelerate promising therapies now, and invest in prevention and social policy for the long term.
Lewis, again, great arguments. Sarah, would you like to respond to Lewis's opening statement?
Yeah, certainly. So some really, really interesting points, and I'm glad that there are some areas where we do agree upon in relation to the investment of dementia funding, really. And I do agree wholeheartedly how much dementia destroys lives. I'm sure there are many, many people in the room have seen how dementia can affect people. And so we do need to look at a cure for dementia. However, what I would be looking at from my perspective is, do we want to continually invest thousands, if not billions of money into medication solutions as well? If we look at some of the medications as well that have the disease modifying medications that have been recommended, when it comes to the funding streams for those, we then have some of the blockades around the cost of that particular medication. So it isn't always about what's effective and what can help. It's also about the cost of that medication from pharmaceutical companies. You also mentioned about the occupational therapy role being valuable. Thank you. That's really appreciated. And yes, absolutely, our role is in prevention. We're not, as a holistic profession, we're not here to cure. We are here to look at those preventative measures. And quite rightly, when you say that there are some biomarkers around, understanding what are these sort of blood-based biomarkers, what are these cognitive elements, and how we can measure those. So if we think then back to the finances and the funding going into prevention, surely it would be better if that money was then spent looking and exploring why there are the different sort of changes within the brain, but from a preventative perspective, I guess. And one last point I want to make as well, I've worked for many years in post-diagnostic memory services. And it's really important that people do get a diagnosis of dementia. I absolutely wholeheartedly agree. And that certainly made a difference for me understanding my mother's very complex fronto-temporal dementia. However, there is another issue around aftercare for people with dementia. So people tend to receive a diagnosis of dementia, and then it's a postcode lottery sometimes, and that treatment and aftercare really falls off the cliff. So there are wider social, economical issues that go on and that wrap around dementia, but we do need to think and consider that aftercare as well. So that's my comment.
Thank you, Sarah. And Lewis, would you like to come back?
Yeah, sorry, I was just taking some notes. Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, that really good points. I completely. First of all, on the touching on the drug development, on and the cost of this. I completely agree. I think that these types of things will be expensive in the beginning. This is the case for first generation treatments, which is what we're seeing now. As you mentioned, we have spent billions. Apologies. We have spent billions on these first generation treatments, and I would say that there are historical parallels that can be made to improve dramatically. Why to show that why there is a case we made for improvement, for dramatic improvement of continued investment. One of these cases is, for example, HIV. HIV was one disease area where we saw that there was continual funding being invested in it for decades and decades, which included billions and billions of pounds. And if we had simply shifted away from that to actually having prevention strategies, we would have lost millions of lives, because the antiviral drugs that we currently have in place that extend life for decades for these populations would have not been possible. And we were mostly shifted into public health campaigns, which are important, to behavioral change, which is incredibly important, and to having safer sexual behaviors. However, this was made possible because of the commitment to overcome the failures and the commitment to overcome the billions of wasted dollars and pounds to actually reach antiviral drugs that work. So prevention interventions are in themselves incredibly expensive as well. One would argue that in some cases they may be even more expensive because of the amount of years that it takes to actually deliver them from a public health perspective, and to actually implement them at scale to make them effective and to make them equitable for all of them, for all people. I think that in terms of the cost efficiency, there is definitely an argument to be made that one could actually eventually trump the other in terms of the cost efficiency that this would bring. So the other argument that you had was around biomarkers, and you mentioned that it would be better for the funding to explore why these changes within the brain are happening from a preventative perspective. I completely agree, but that is precisely what treatments like DMTs do, is addressing that pathology that has been identified. We would not have treatments were it not for us to understand the actual pathology of what happens in biologically in the brain. So this research in this area would actually inform both prevention and treatments. But I think it would even benefit a lot more the treatment side, where we would actually be able to have much more effective and targeted disease-modifying therapies. Sorry, did you want to come in, Adam?
Well, no, your 4 minutes is definitely up, Lewis, for your rebuttal. But I want to pick you both up on a point. But before I do, just a reminder to people watching that you can post your questions. We're going to have time to put both your questions to Sarah and Lewis in a little while. Which is, you'd both agree that as it stands right now, we still don't actually know 100% of the time the fundamental cause of the disease in the first place. So as Sarah, you picked up on up to 40% of cases might be preventable if people make the relevant lifestyle interventions that we know from the likes of the Lancet report. Are we throwing money down the drain on finding treatments if we still don't actually know the underlying cause? Should we first find the cause, Lewis, before we spend money on treatments? Or is it okay? Should we still be treating what we know now? But of course, are those treatments right if they're treating what our current understanding is not what the cause of the disease is?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think that the recent research, the recent approvals, and positive results from phase 3 trials for these disease modifying therapies that target beta amyloid show that these biological targets can be modified and that the clinical benefit is possible. There are obviously the biggest argument that we currently have against these disease modifying therapies is less so on the biological targets, but more so on the side effects that come with it. So the ARIA, which is a serious side effect that can cause damage to the brain and long-term side effects, and also the cost effectiveness of these treatments. There is definitely an argument to be made around, could this be more targeted to the pathology, what stage of the disease they could be coming in. But again, just to reiterate, these are first generation treatments. They are not going to be the perfect solution. And this is why the argument should be that we need to invest more.
So the treatments we're referring to, the likes of donanemab and lecanemab, that remove amyloid.
Yes.
But what they don't get to the point is they don't. Well, I don't think we know yet, do we? Whether they then stop amyloid coming back unless you continue to treat them, or what put the amyloid there in the first place, or the tangles. If we can agree that any treatment to because none of these treatments are going to grow the brain back.
No.
So if we can agree that any treatment you receive
Mm.
will need to be given early enough that it hasn't already like severely impacted your
Yeah.
cognition or your brain in the first place, do we get to a point where cure and prevention are fundamentally the same thing? That actually the drugs you might need to give somebody are the treatment they need in advance of them getting it. A bit like I don't know, a statin,
Mm.
for example.
Mm.
You take a statin to stop cholesterol, but I mean, fine, sure. Actually, statin's probably not a great example because the statin you can take later and it'll reduce. And but so are cure and prevention eventually going to become the same thing? Sarah, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that there is a marriage, a partnership of the two together, to be honest with you. I think that the important part is that we still don't have a cure for dementia. And the brain is such a very, very complex structure. It's going to take years and years of research funding to really fully understand the complexities of dementia. And I suppose it's how many more lives are lost, day on day, year on year, really. If we think, for example, I know we're focused on sort of one type of dementia and sort of medication, but there are so many different types of dementia. As we know, dementia is an umbrella term, and we currently have different types of dementia where it is underfunding into sort of, the real causes of why those dementias are occurring. A lot of the funding goes into predominantly Alzheimer's disease. So it's just considering as well, if, for example, we think around vascular dementia, when we have a look at the preventative causes of vascular dementia, we've learned an awful lot about strokes, TIAs. We've learned an awful lot about blood flow and the role of blood flow within the brain and and oxygen, etc., and the different body systems that are associated. And yet, as you mentioned, a lot of the treatments that are available for people with vascular dementia can be statins, which has got a really vital role to play. But as I've mentioned earlier, that is just one of very, very many types of dementia.
So Sarah, wouldn't advancements in finding treatments actually, in your role as an occupational therapist, make your life easier potentially? Because what you might be able to do is to stop the deterioration that you currently see, where your intervention obviously has to change as people progress with the disease. So treatments would help therapy.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Of course, prevention would potentially stop people getting it in the first place.
Absolutely, yeah. But as I say, it's a partnership, and I suppose it's what proportion of that partnership is invested in.
I want to pick up on another point though, which is, so as it stands right now, until we understand the fundamental causes, any funding that was diverted from treatment into prevention is likely, until we come up with some more ideas or understand the disease more, to end up getting spent on programs that focus on those 40%.
Yes.
It's going to end up getting spent on lifestyle and hearing loss and cardiovascular disease and things, but 60% of the people will still go on to develop dementia eventually. We know that if you tell people to stop smoking, they'll get cancer, that they don't necessarily stop smoking.
No.
Is this then a good use of money? Will people, those immediate lifestyle and public health focuses, will they realistically change the current system?
I think it's a long journey of changing habits, and I think we've talked about kind of generational changes as well. If we think now, there's a big shift in sort of the 18 to 21 year age group. They've gone from kind of smoking to vaping. We've also got evidence that that age group, for example, aren't drinking alcohol as much as other generations as well. And we know that if we do health promotion and preventative work, campaigns and research, that it can have that cross-generational and, in generations to come, we will be able to see some shifts. There are several research studies that have followed groups and populations of people from sort of being at that kind of leaving school age up to the milestones of marriage and going into middle age and so on and so on. And I think there needs to be sort of more of these longitudinal studies in so that we can understand lifestyle changes, lifestyle choices, without even going into things around kind of pollutants and, all of the kind of, food and the different things, the way that food is grown, the way that we've got different pollutants, etc. And when I say that the brain is complex, it's the effects of all those different complexities that go on in and around the world, and the choices that we do make that have an impact upon dementia. So it's a lot of complexity to unpick. But if we don't look at the prevention stance, then we then are going to get more and more people affected by dementia.
So that funding wouldn't be a waste. It would just increase the uptake on that 40%, which ultimately would reduce the number of people developing. Alongside, you would assume, programs to better understand the disease in the first place so that we can prevent early. Lewis, you're going to argue that, of course, that's great, but if your mum's got dementia right now and you're looking for something that can make next week a better week than it otherwise would have been, realistically, where do you think we're at with it? What would be the impact on ongoing trials if money did rebalance?
It rebalanced towards prevention? I think it would be catastrophic. I think that we would basically be right, in essence, telling these other 55 to 60% of people, we are no longer prioritizing you, and we are going to be prioritizing the people that can have a preventable cause of dementia, which are, in this case, a minority of people. I think that would be a very hard pill to swallow for people that have family members with dementia, people that have recently been diagnosed with dementia. And in essence, they will lose hope because there would be a divestment of treatment. And that would mean they would no longer be able to have a potential treatment or cure in the horizon that could be made available over the next few years. How many is, I think, is obviously debatable. And I would not say that it's going to be in the next 5 years or in the next 10 years. The currently available ones are extremely limited, as I mentioned. But that really goes to drive the point that that's why we cannot stop now the research. Now that we are finally having encouraging results for treating dementia, regardless if it was modifiable or not. This is for dementias that have the pathology of Alzheimer's disease, but it's regardless of them being preventable or not, because there are genetic components. These are individuals that could benefit from it, and hopefully these disease-modifying therapies will eventually be generalizable to other types of dementia. There are obviously cases like what Sarah mentioned that are vascular dementias that can be preventable by behaviors that reduce vascular impact, but these only account for 17% of the total dementias. What about the other 83%? So it's very much around us, in my opinion. The moral choice and the humane choice is not to ignore the people that are currently diagnosed and that will be diagnosed that cannot be preventing, and also acknowledging the fact that preventable strategies are really encouraging and really strong, and I think we should all employ them. Everyone all should be doing them.
This is going to be a hard debate to call, because honestly, the arguments in both favour. I can see the both sides of this. Sarah, is there any evidence that suggests prevention research offers the best return on investment for dementia outcomes?
Sorry, say that again.
Is there any kind of evidence that prevention research offers a best return on investment for outcomes?
There is some evidence to suggest that yes, there is the financial benefit, and if you think about what's important is if we can save one person's life, then that person's life is important. What I would argue as well is that we can't start to unpick figures wholeheartedly into the benefits of that, because proportionally we are kind of down here when it comes to prevention, and the scales of the balance are kind of tipped out of our favor. So anything that we do try to explore and we do try to get some findings on are always going to look proportionally smaller, which means our impact is going to look proportionally smaller as well.
Can I ask when you're thinking about prevention research, what we're saying is we're not focusing in just on lifestyle, that what we're saying is that we want to look at, say, like air pollution, or I don't know, gum disease, or in addition to diet. That's your view, is the focus in those spaces that. So almost like, am I right in thinking you're almost saying you want to spend more research in understanding the cause to reduce the cause,
yes,
or to remove that cause?
Yes, absolutely. Because if we don't understand, if we can't fully understand something, then what we're doing is we are kind of putting a sticky plaster over something. So, as I said earlier, it's a partnership between finding out the root cause of something, along that journey, kind of then putting in the preventative measures, but then there is an element of an important relationship with the treatment as well. And just going back to the point before about having someone, say, with vascular dementia, and absolutely they want that help now. I've been in many situations where the first point of call from a patient or a relative has been, what medication is there? What's going to help me? What's going to cure this? And those are conversations that are very, very hard and very, very difficult to have with people in front of you. But if we're thinking about our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, then we've got to think about the future as well. It's not about us sat here now in this moment. It's about what this future needs to look like as well.
Well, let's go to our audience questions. I'm going to focus initially on the audience questions, and then because there are quite a few just points as well. So we'll initially look at the questions, and then I'll make sure that we flag the points. So those questions here are, let's go to the first one. At a previous discussion I attended about this, let me spotlight this one to start with. Here we go. At a previous discussion I attended about this, there was a statistic that if we prevent dementia by just prevent dementia by just 5 years, over 50% of those with the diagnosis will never reach late stages. Lewis, what are your thoughts on that? So I guess this is kind of delaying the onset by 5 years means that people never then necessarily get old enough, or I guess something else will get to them before their dementia does.
I've never come across this statistic. I wonder what it means. Does this mean that through disease-modifying therapies that will late stages? So if we delay,
it was the charities used a lot a few years ago, wasn't it? That even just delaying the onset by 5 years can save this much money. So this was delaying onset rather than. But I guess that's where a treatment could help, because if a treatment.
That's exactly what I was going to argue. It's actually an argument in favor of a treatment.
A few technical problems for Lewis. I think we're going to take that question off there. Let's take the while Lewis finds his connection again. Let me just jump around and find the questions. Here we go. Would funding put towards prevention rather than treatment leave millions of people with a diagnosis of dementia or with undiagnosed early dementia with a lack of cure and potentially increased mortality within the disease? As if funding was put towards treatment, then these people already with a dementia diagnosis could be treated. Would you love to hear your opinion on how this leaves currently diagnosed individuals rather? Sarah, I mean, this is a good one for you to take anyway, because you know, as an occupational therapist, you're working with people living with dementia now. Where do you stand on this?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good question. And what we don't want to do is we don't want to kind of, remove the funding in relation to people getting diagnosed with dementia, or make sort of any sort of movables with the funding. What we're asking for is a balance, a rebalance. Really, we're looking at having that proportion of funding that is put more into kind of preventative measures. We do know, going back to diagnosing people with dementia, yes, we've got a lot better at diagnosing people with dementia. The dementia diagnosis rates have gone up. What we've also seen, though, is we've also seen a lot of people with dementia and family carers distressed as a lack of support. And that lack of support can come in with the research around, the different tips and strategies and advice that can help someone to live as well as they can do. The trajectory of the disease of dementia is always going to have its own pathway. So it isn't something that there is any current treatment or drug at the moment that's going to take that completely away. And we certainly don't want to, remove any diagnosis with dementia.
So let's take our next question. I'm going to put this one to Lewis. What do we know about new therapies, and do they work as well for women? Because both prevention and treatment efforts need to take into account sex gender differences.
Yes. So we know that currently the disease-modifying therapies that we're seeing, as far as I know, don't show particular differences in terms of gender. We are seeing potentially that in terms of the recruitment of patients, there are some disparities in terms of ethnicity. For example, there is a low representation of ethnicity. We are not assuming that there are any particular differences right now in terms of disease-modifying therapy. We are seeing that women with these conditions tend to be less exposed to these MTs and take up less. But I think more concerning than that is actually the fact that there is an inequity in terms of ethnic people from minority ethnic groups that are being recruited into these trials. And part of the reason why I just attended recently the Alzheimer's Society annual conference is actually quite concerning, because the eligibility criteria for some of these disease-modifying therapies includes not having cardiovascular disease, because it precludes the actual eligibility for treatment. But we see that actually people from Black and South Asian communities have a higher proportion, higher incidence of cardiovascular disease. So actually, we are in effect excluding groups of people that may benefit from this, where there is a higher impact of dementia in these populations, in comparison to white counterparts where this should be reduced. So definitely, I think there's also an argument there to be made that more investment needs to be made on treatment to actually address these disparities.
Yeah, I understand that. We've got one more question.
If I could just jump in there very, very quickly as well, from what Lewis was saying, having worked with different populations of people clinically, what we find is that there are lots of cultural differences. There are lots of sort of discrimination as well within their own communities. Sometimes there isn't even a phrase or a word for dementia. So that's kind of around that lack of understanding. So sometimes if we kind of do that work around prevention and education, then we can reduce some of those problems when it comes to cardiovascular disease as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think they made the same point last time, that actually we had last week's debate was on whether a genetic test would be useful, and actually both our speakers agreed that actually blood pressure tests would probably be more valuable and more impactful. Sarah, there's another question here, which is, do you think dementia, due to its being a complex heterogeneous disease, can ever truly be prevented, i.e. lifestyle factors can be changed, but if people are genetically predisposed to this disease, will we ever truly be able to offer prevention? In which case, focusing on diagnosis and treatment would be best.
Yeah, good question. I think that, because it is such a complex disease, I think, and because there are some genetic dispositions as well, it's like, for example, you might, in the best will in the world, live the best life that you can do, but you still might be genetically disposed to lots and lots of different diseases, and certainly dementia comes into that. Sometimes we've seen strains within families where there's been generations of people having, say, for example, Alzheimer's disease or other different types of dementia. So there is the argument that, you could do everything you possibly could do in relation to not smoking, not doing any excessive drinking, doing lots and lots of exercise, etc., and you could still end up being diagnosed with
And for those people, you can understand that they'd want a treatment for what they had, and a better understanding as to what gave it to them in the first place. Which actually brings me to, I'm going to move on now from the questions. But there's been a lot of really important comments made in the chat, which I want to bring in here. Martin Robertson made some good points, which is that. So Martin, for those who don't know, Martin's a regular viewer and contributor to the community. Martin's living with dementia himself in Scotland. And he makes a few points here, which is early diagnosis better, knowing taking reduction measures would be important. Also, here we go. He considered himself so I think he made a point in the chat, which I can't spotlight, which is lived a pretty healthy lifestyle and got it anyway. So he would have been the one, if we were to shift focus of funding onto prevention, it can't only focus on lifestyle, because it wouldn't have potentially wouldn't have helped him. I don't have a gene, my dementia is just my life, as you can see there. Let's go. It makes another good point here. Thank you, Martin, for all your contributions. I'm not suffering, my loved ones do. There's no causal link for dementia. Unlike smoking, prevention easily becomes victim blaming, and I've lived a pretty sensible life. It's a good point. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about prevention, which if needs to be put in such a way where you can't just say, hey, you ate a bad diet through your life, or you're smoked, and so, well, it's inevitable you had a heart attack or you got dementia. Lewis, sorry, you.
Yeah, I just want to apologize. I really need to jump into another meeting that I have work related.
Well, we're going to take your closing. I'm going to flag a few while you're making your closing remarks. I'll flag these up on the screen, the last comments. But
thank you,
Lewis. Why don't you make your closing remarks first?
Sure. So, I think that there is my strongest argument is there is the ethical choice that the patients now should be our first duty, and this includes the 60 million people currently globally who are suffering today with dementia. I think that the hope of prevention lies on the possibility of 45% of people being completely 45% of people that could have dementias could be preventable through modifiable risk factors. I think that figure is very optimistic and would require significant cost to the system. And in my opinion, we must fund hope where it's urgently needed, and continue on capitalizing this new wave of treatments that we currently have to really make sure that we don't miss the opportunity. So that's my view, although I obviously take the point that we should not divest in prevention, but we should also not tip the scales away from treatment.
Thank you very much. Sarah?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for all the different points that have been raised, and thank you to Lewis as well. I suppose my closing statement is just around that I think that we should co-create more with people with the lived experience of dementia, and certainly within research to understand their needs, but also to understand dementia in a kind of preventative and in a treatment kind of perspective. And I suppose just finally, what I would like is just a balancing of the funding, so that we're not taking away the funding for medication or for a cure, but we're also looking at those preventative measures as well. So it's just balancing the funding more.
So I want to invite, sorry, Lewis had another meeting which he's had to rush off to. I'm going to invite you all now to participate in our closing poll. Let's see how opinions have potentially shifted. There's a link in the chat there for the closing poll, which I'm going to share my screen in a little while. So you've heard today how prevention, from Sarah's perspective, offers the most valuable return on investment, not just on the 40%, but on to everybody. And Lewis making a very good point that people living with dementia right now are really hopeful that these treatments, understanding that might not cure them, but will certainly make life livable for longer. And if they can catch it early enough, potentially give them many more years of life as well, which will, of course, then keep Sarah in work as an occupational therapist. Will have customers living with some level of disease for longer.
Yeah.
Not that I'm sure you need any extra work, Sarah.
No, we're busy enough. There's a national shortage of us, so we don't need any more work.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everybody. So again, in the chat there, we have the final poll. I'm going to share my screen now, so please do vote in that final poll. The link there is in the chat. Let's go and have a look at the results so we can see how opinions change. So I'm just going to remind you, in the opening poll, 43% agreed with the motion, 29% disagreed, and 43% disagreed, 29% were undecided. And now in our closing poll, which there is still time, keep your votes coming in. I'm going to share my screen now. So here are the closing poll's results. 11% still undecided. I'm just going to flick across there. Sorry, I can't remember what it was before. 43, 29, 43, 29, 29. And now it is
even.
So I think in this current standing, Lewis has managed to take a larger share of the vote. But Sarah, your proportion has remained unstained. So everybody, I think, who was with you at the start, you've kept people on your side. Still interesting that 11% are undecided. That's the most undecided we've had for one of these debates. And I think what that really demonstrates is that this is a difficult topic. And in reality, as we've said at the start, what we really need to ensure is that there is a good balance of research funding, whether that's across caring for people living with the disease, improving diagnosis, preventing people from getting it in the first place, and treating those that are people living with the disease today. A balance across all of these areas is what's most important. But we've got to stop people getting it in the first place, and then we won't need, hopefully, treatments. Thank you very much for joining us today. Oh, Sarah, you just had a last-minute vote. But I hope you will all, thank you very much. Trying to find my notes here. So there we go. Thank you very much to Sarah Page and Louis Tojo for joining me today, and thank you to all of you for taking part and for sending all your questions in this afternoon. And don't forget to join us for our upcoming debate, which will be happening next Wednesday in the evening, where we're going to address the question: this house believes that AI, or artificial intelligence, is furthering disparities in research and care.
Ooh.
We'll have Dr. Isabel Castano from Harvard Medical School arguing in favor of that for the House, and Dr. Eleanor Cole from University of Oxford, who will be arguing against that. That's next Wednesday at 8 p.m. in the evening. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next week in the salon. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you.
You were brilliant.
Thank
Have
you.
a great day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.